I would like to welcome you all to the Pacific Seminar Series of the Australian Centre for Pacific Islands Research. And welcome back to what is our third last seminar for the year. So it's quite crazy to think that we're almost at the end. Before we do get started, I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we meet today, which is the Gubbi Gubbi people, and acknowledge the people that have lived on this land before us and the true custodians moving forward. Now, with that said, today we're really fortunate to have Richard Markham and Wayne Hancock here talking to us about the opportunities for developing coffee as a foundation crop for resilient livelihood systems in the Pacific Islands. Now, before we get started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about these two presenters, since they've both got some pretty interesting experiences that I think is worth sharing. So Dr. Richard Markham, he's worked mainly in Africa, Latin America and Europe on biological control, integrated pest management and genetic resources conservation. And this was before he came to Fiji in 2008. I hope I'm getting this correct, Richard. This is what you gave me. Yep. He came to Fiji as a research program manager for the new Pacific Crops program with ACPIR. And after almost 10 years of managing research for development projects across ACR's Indo-Pacific region, he then retired to Fiji to set up a small business and try his hand at achieving sustainable development outcomes in a private sector context. Now, we did have Richard do a seminar with us, I think it was a year ago now, maybe Richard, where he did share some further insight into this particular project. There's chocolate involved. So if you're interested, go back and have a look at our videos that we've got recorded on our website, and it will link you to the YouTube channel where you can see that. But that's not for today. So we'll leave that for another time. And the other presenter is Dr. Wayne Hancock. So he's joining with us online. Unfortunately, we don't have his camera working today, so you don't get to see his beautiful face, but we can imagine what it might look like. Very handsome, very handsome. Very handsome, apparently. I haven't seen him in person either. So he has a background in farming and interest in plants and horticulture. His work is in this area, his work in this particular area and research and development has taken him across Australia, Asia, and Africa, with his master's research based on his work in Malawi. Wayne, he's continued in academia and international development before he completed a multidisciplinary PhD at Southern Cross University. And this focused on the release of the first genetically modified crop in Australia, the Ingard cotton. So we could definitely pick his brain about that, I think. Wayne has spent many years in Malawi, China, Sudan, Ethiopia, Mongolia, and Myanmar with his project work in agriculture, water, and environment. He's recently returned to Australia and Southern Cross University with ACR work and various international consultancies. So I think it's safe to say that both our presenters here today have a wealth of knowledge in their areas, and I'm excited to hear from them. So I won't take up any more of your time. I'll let them explain to you what they're going to talk to you about today in regards to this new project with coffee. So I'll hand you over to Wayne now. Wayne's going to start the seminar. And if you do have questions throughout, don't hesitate to pop them into the chat, or at the end, we'll also have some time there to ask questions. So I'm just going to share the screen and get those slides up for everybody. There we go. All right, Wayne, when you're ready, you can start.
Hello, everyone. I'm just trying to get the full screen here so I can see what I'm looking at. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and I hope you can hear me clearly. Is everyone able to hear me clearly?
Pretty good.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about the opportunities for developing coffee as a foundation crop for resilience in the Pacific. This kind of developed out of some work that we did over the last few years in Fiji and to a lesser extent in Vanuatu. Next slide, Richie. Okay, so coffee's been around for a long time and everybody's familiar with it and probably addicted to it. So I think, the crop's been around for quite a while, but it really only started to spread once Europeans primarily got into and the Arab population got into Africa and spread it around. And it's one of the many crops which was introduced to the Pacific countries as well as other countries as a potential high value export. Thanks, Richie. So Linnaeus obviously described coffee from Ethiopia, and I'll just try and move this thing out of the road. So there we go. So coffee arabica from the highlands of Ethiopia. However, there are many species of coffee, and there are 12 prominent ones in Africa. Lowland coffee in Africa, especially Caneforia, Coffea caneforia, or robusta coffee. And also liberica are used, and there are a couple of others which are used and which are now important in breeding. So it's obviously one of the most traded crops around the world, 100 million US. So it's quite a big crop. Thanks, Richie. In our region here, PNG has been a prominent coffee producer for quite a long time, but it's running into problems now with coffee berry borer and also aging trees, so that's causing problems there. It's been around the Pacific for quite a while, and even in Fiji, it was produced commercially up until the 70s. In Vanuatu, there's a couple of plantations which were established in the 60s and 70s that are still in production on Tanna, and there's also a few other smaller plantations such as Aoria Island, and there's a very good research centre in Vanuatu which has a good coffee collection there, produces very good coffee. Thanks, Richie.
So that picture is, by the way, is from the PNG Highlands growing coffee just as a monocrop under Casuarina.
So in Fiji, the commercial coffee production ceased some time ago, but coffee has become naturalised there in the gallery forest and along creeks and in quite a wide range of environments. So it was really quite interesting to start exploring this from a genetic point of view and also from a variety point of view. Thanks, Richie. Now, when we went to, we're working in the agroforestry project there, we were looking for economic drivers because it was fairly obvious that, farmers didn't see any advantage in planting trees. So we were not getting too much traction in terms of getting people interested on anything other than a very small scale. But in looking for an economic driver, coffee was one that stood out, not because it was grown commercially, but because Bula Coffee had established a system for paying women to wild harvest coffee, and then they processed the coffee and then used the coffee from there. So Bula did a great job in setting up a network of coffee collection throughout Fiji. And they did this by setting up a bank account for individual women and a barcode. So women have limited time in which they can harvest coffee. But with the barcode, they could, when they had time, go out, usually went out as a group, harvested wild coffee, put into a bag with their barcode, and then they were paid for it directly into their account. So it was very beneficial for women because the money didn't go to men, it went directly to the women and they could do what they wanted with that. Thanks, Richie. So we looked at coffee there, and one thing which was obvious was when we looked at where they were collecting from, they were collecting quite a few different varieties of coffee. And, I didn't know the varieties at the time, but it was obvious that there's a lot of acclimatized coffee there. And as a way of trying to find out what was going on there, we looked at the diversity of this coffee, and we found quite a wide diversity. That photo you see there is very similar to what we think is the Ethiopian strains of coffee in Fiji. It's growing in one particular area up in the little highland patch, and it's got unusual character. It forms clusters of coffee rather than more spread out bunches, and the colour changes quite a lot from that into a much darker colour, very similar to the Ethiopian types. So I think finding a way of developing this is really, really important. But the problem is that the wild harvested coffee has issues, so we have to work on developing an integrated system, part of the agri-food system there, to make it worthwhile, and then we can then get some traction and scale it up. Thanks, Richard. Now, that's once again a shot of that same coffee. It's quite an interesting plant, and it was very different from some of the other ones we looked at. So as we said, we tried to find an economic driver. Coffee and cocoa were two obvious ones because they both do well there, but getting people to reforest areas is really difficult. The EU spent quite a lot of money on a reforestation project, and basically it didn't go anywhere because they really couldn't get people interested, because there was no economic driver in planting a tree which they might get a value from in 30 years' time, or sometime even longer than that. So while we may think it's a nice idea and it's good environmentally to plant long-term trees, people need a return on their labour, basically, and it's not happening just by planting trees. So the trees are not being planted. But coffee, on the other hand, where women can wild harvest it, and it becomes an economic driver because you can integrate it into a forest system, and then people have a value and see a value in looking after the forest trees as well as the coffee or cocoa. So Bula did a great job in establishing this model, and I think we put a fair bit of effort into helping Bula improve what they were doing post-harvest and so forth, and that improved their coffee. And there's now people trying to emulate Bula's model by going to the same villages and trying to basically pinch their coffee farmers. So, it demonstrates the value of what we're doing. Thanks, Richie. So why not keep just harvesting in the wild? Well, there's a few issues. Obviously, the women have limited time in which to harvest coffee. So they do it one morning, sometimes 2 mornings a week. Usually they try to do it as a group activity. Otherwise, they're constrained by all the other things that they are doing. So that's an obviously a limiting factor, and probably the majority of the coffee actually goes to waste. The quality of the coffee is variable. There's no inputs provided, and coffee berry borer, which we also proved was there in our study, has a significant impact on reducing yield. Now, you can walk into the wild coffee and say, well, we can improve this a lot. We can thin it out, prune it and so forth. But that then means it's not wild coffee. And if it's not wild coffee, the women can't harvest it and get the money. So, that was a big frustration, because it would have been quite easy to do a lot in a very short time to improve the coffee. So anyway, we need to build new systems new farming systems, if you like, to make it work. Now, with the current system as it is, wild coffee can provide a lot of information, and there's also a lot of existing genetics there, but trying to integrate those into a system which we can make work requires a lot more input. Thanks, Richard. Now, we spent a lot of time as part of what we're doing in one community called Nandramai, and that's outside of Sigatoga. And Nandramai took quite some time to get, to accept us as people working there, and we worked on agroforestry there and a number of other things. And as in any situation, their situation varies from people further up the valley, and varies quite a lot from the situation where the earlier photos from the Ethiopian type coffee was. So one size doesn't fit all. And accessing land is probably the biggest problem. It took us 5 years for the community elders to agree that the women probably should grow coffee on their own land, and they were willing to give them a hectare of coffee. So that was 5 years from the start of the project to the end, when someone said, oh, yep, well, maybe they should just grow coffee over here. And that's the kind of thing which people don't understand about working in some of these environments. And obviously, if you worked in the Pacific or other areas yourself, you can't just walk in with a solution. You've got to develop the solution with the community and develop the farming systems and try a few things and work through that. So one of the things we did was looked at the genetics and across the region, across the country, and we found quite a variety of material there, which is quite interesting. The other value, of course, is a lot of this stuff is acclimatized. Now, providing the quality is good, acclimatized coffee is easier to start with, or easier to develop a new industry. Thanks, Richard. That's good. And so the purpose of the reason we did it was basically that reason. We wanted to find out what was there, because when you went to different areas, the coffee looked different. It was obviously different genetically. And what we found was a mix, quite a wide mix. We sent 7 samples away, and every sample was different. So we found some of the original arabica material. We found a few robusta. We found quite a lot of hybrids. We found some which they thought were probably very early Ethiopian, and some liberica. And liberica is a coffee which is also used as a rootstock. But the Ethiopian coffee from there was quite interesting, because it's likely to be a very early introduction, and that material is no longer available worldwide because it's now protected in Ethiopia. So that was one area where we thought there was a lot of value in that, because it also scored well in the customer's assessment. However, the work we did was very cursory in terms of an initial stab at what was there, and we obviously didn't find everything, and there was a lot more material there which we could work on, and I think that's really important. The research also needs to be supported with proper research on quality, established through a process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, because Southern Cross University is doing a project on that. But genetics are there. We can also introduce new genetics, but even working on what is there, I think we can improve that a lot, and that would be the basis of an industry, and we can get that started fairly quickly because the seed source is there. Thanks, Richard. So as I said, the women want to grow coffee, and for the first time, as we said, it took 5 years to get to that point. So I'd be really sad if we wasted this opportunity. And I think working with the women first off is a great way to start. The women have demonstrated that their desire to do this, and they've also demonstrated an ongoing effort in building the wild coffee into their own little businesses, if you like, and that's been really important. There's also a lot of local knowledge out there, and we haven't really tapped into that in the way we should. But if you look at for example, just the spread of harvest, coffee is normally has a very limited harvest period, but if you look at both the spread within the harvesting areas, normally there's 6 weeks within one village, 6 to 8 weeks. But when you look at across the environments in Fiji, where they were getting 3 to 4 months of wild harvesting. Now that's pretty significant in terms of an industry, because that also means that those varieties, while there's different environments involved, those varieties are also coming into production over a longer period of time. So that's another area where we can look at in terms of developing a more viable industry by spreading harvesting out over time, a longer time frame. So I think the challenge is really to work out an integrated production system. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there for students and student projects, because once we get some gardens established as an integrated agroforestry type activity, there's an awful lot of measuring and work that can go on from that. And there'll be good honours and master's students and even PhD student projects in that. There are some significant issues in terms of the coffee berry borer, but a lot of work's been done on that in South America. So there are quite good biological control methods using Bavaria, fungi and so forth. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that area as well for students to work out simple control mechanisms that can be applied fairly easily. Throughout the rest of the system, there's post-harvest and scale. Scale is an important issue, because to make the mechanical pulping and so forth viable, then you need scale. At the moment, Bula's can do a lot of that work, and I think that's good. But in the long term, to develop a large-scale industry, we need to move beyond that, because we'll eventually end up, if it works out that way, with a lot of coffee in a lot of different environments, and then they'll need to be serviced appropriately. Thanks, Richard.
Well, so, yeah, go on, Wayne.
Just quickly, from this work, also quite a bit of other work followed. Now, we sent those samples of both for quality and for the genetic analysis to the World Coffee Research Institute, or the World Coffee Institute, I think it's called. So we developed a dialogue with them over time, even though there were issues with sending the material and so forth. But they gave Southern Cross University access to what was called, what they felt was the 20 best lines, coffee breeding lines from around the world. And these have been established, those that survived, they came in as tissue culture, we lost a few. They've been established at Austinville Research Station near Lismore. And when you look at that material and you compare it to wild coffee, the difference is astounding. Some of those varieties that are doing well there, they're dwarf varieties, they're meant for mechanical harvesting. They're about 1/2 metre tall or 1 metre tall, covered in fruit. They're just phenomenally productive and the quality is good. Now, in addition to that, the New South Wales Coffee Industry Association wanted to work out, how to work out coffee quality better. So with some funding, the university has started a project where they actually start with green beans all the way through to finished coffee. Now they're collecting samples from around the world, and I got them some samples out of Malawi, as well as we haven't put stuff through the Pacific yet, but we will do that. So they're starting with green bean. They're putting the green bean through a HPLC gas chromatograph analysis. Then they're roasting it under standard conditions. Then they're checking the roasted coffee under the same chemical analysis system. Then they're cupping it, and then they're doing standard follow-up taste testing. So what we're trying to work out is a benchmarking system, if you like, for quality, where you can send in a sample of green bean, and they will be able to tell you if it's roasted in this manner, what the quality is like. Now, that's the sort of work which will support this work in Fiji, because we really don't know a lot of the information now, and we want to get out of the subjectivity areas and get into the science areas. So I think there's a lot of science behind this idea and concept, as well as doing the work on the ground. So the small amount of work we did in Fiji has actually led to quite a lot of other areas, into our other areas, which are really important to build on. And I think that, we're at a point now where if we can move into the next phase of this, then we can really have an impact. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks very much, Wayne. Can you hear me okay on this microphone? Yeah. So Wayne has kind of set the scene, particularly on the coffee technology and coffee science and the bit of the research needs and opportunities going forward. If you, with your permission, I'd like to spend about 10 minutes maybe setting this work in context, and particularly to try to reflect with you guys on how this project might be handled going forward, because as you will have gathered from what Wayne said, there's some serious complexities as developing this industry in Fiji. We've talked about traditional attitudes to what are considered women's work, and their challenges with gaining access to resources. So some really promising coffee materials, but what would it actually take to move this into something that could actually improve livelihoods and perhaps make contribution to more sustainable agri-food systems? So just want to share with you in a couple of slides some ideas about the problem that we're trying to tackle, or that coffee might be part of the answer. So if you have a look at this picture here, this is fairly typical of what we call the high islands in the Pacific, i.e. the non-atoll ones. The trade winds come from somewhere on the left of your picture there. They bring warm, moist air in, and as they come up over the hills, they drop most of the moisture. So pretty much every high island in the Pacific has a wet side and a dry side. What unfortunately happens is that the dry side of these islands gets very rapidly and severely and easily degraded, as you can see here. This is the northeast corner of Viti Levu in Fiji, so sort of Raki area. Now, this is taken last dry season, just from an inter-island flight. No fancy drones were used in this operation. And so you look at that rather degraded looking brown area and just reflect for a moment. The rainfall there is at least 1,500 or 1,600 millimeters. Under normal circumstances, that should be forest, right? Ecologically, that would be probably semi-deciduous forest. In the Fiji context, it would probably have been covered with or dominated by Vesi trees, Insia bijuga. But like many of the forest or the drier forest types in the Pacific, this land is fire sensitive. So with just a little bit of burning, you get into a fairly rapid downward spiral. And you see how the clouds gather over the bits that are still forested, and they're dispersed from the bits that have been deforested. And this is kind of a vicious downward circle, because in those hot areas, the rainfall you then get, instead of being nice, gentle rain every afternoon or every evening from the condensation from the forest, tends to be when it really heats up and you get thunderstorms. And this results in fairly rapid loss of topsoil, runoff, very little percolation into the soil, and lots of runoff of siltation of those beautiful coral reefs that you can see in the foreground. So when you go down to ground level, you can still see that this is a pretty heavily degraded landscape. It's actually it's sort of dominated by non-productive invasive species. The crop there is mainly sugarcane, but as you can probably see, it's pretty weedy and unproductive. The hills have been planted up with Caribbean pine, which then have been not done terribly well, or Honduran pine, have not done terribly well as they get cleared. A lot of erosion. The pretty red tree in the foreground here, that's the African tulip tree, Spathodea campanulata, and that forms very almost impenetrable thickets. You can see a bit of burning in the foreground, but that's just burning of sugarcane trash, which in principle has been discouraged in Fiji, but is still the main land use practice. But perhaps what's more significant, you see in these middle distance here, the hills there. You have to think that probably the traditional flora of Fiji included about 5 or 6 species of grasses, most of them forest grasses that were found in swamps or small clearings in the forest. Anything you see as grassland there reflects post-European introductions, and people brought in grasses to feed cattle and other grazing animals. You know, in other parts of the world, including here in Queensland, you see a grassy hill like that, you say, oh, it's grazing land, isn't it? But this land isn't actually grazed. That's very unproductive Imperata cylindrica savanna. And they say, not productive. It's just burnt every year as a sort of land management practice. So we've got quite a challenge in, and you know, you have to ask this, sorry, using a term like degraded landscape sounds a bit judgmental. I suppose what I should say more carefully is that this is a landscape which does not serve the livelihood aspirations of the landholders and land users. They're not getting what they need out of this. The price of sugar is very low, the productivity is very low, it's actually quite difficult to convert this land into different, more productive forms of land use that do meet people's livelihood expectations. That was the picture that we used at the beginning. This is roughly what you see as on final approach to Nandi Airport. So if you're on holiday, you think, oh, isn't that pretty? Blue sea, sunny hillsides, right? But it's actually something of a landscape in crisis. Do you see that plume of mud going out into the bay? So that river originates in the hills behind, very close to this community Nandramai that Wayne mentioned as one of the areas where they were trying to do agroforestry and looking at the potential of coffee. And what's happened here is that the lowlands were covered in sugar, which is now no longer productive or profitable particularly, and the middle level hills that were under pine plantations have been felled and not replanted. They're subject to very severe erosion. That erosion is going down into the rivers. You can see the siltation around these U-bends going into the floodplain, and then we're getting lots of siltation out onto the coral reefs. So in some ways, you could say that if you look at it as an agricultural landscape, it's to some extent a landscape in crisis that's no longer managed for the benefits, or no longer being successfully managed for the benefits of the communities that live on it. So just to sort of look at what our aspirations are, we're not just looking at environmental aspects of sustainability. We're trying to look at things that might work to be socially sustainable for the aspirations of people and communities, and economically viable. I'll come back to some of those things. So I think we're losing the headline behind some of the software stuff, but basically this is the saying that's suggesting that the current cash crop based systems are no longer sustainable, and these are some of the reasons. I think common sense, but also reinforced by a recent study done by CSIRO across the Pacific Islands, looking at long-term data about soil quality, has shown that basically all current agricultural systems in the Pacific Islands are mining nutrients and degrading the natural resource base. There are actually no systems that are actually increasing their productivity. We talk a lot in agriculture and agronomy about increasing productivity. It's the opposite at the moment in the Pacific Islands. There's a steady decrease in productivity and a loss of natural resources. Also, with depleting biodiversity, both terrestrial and marine, through various things, not just deforestation, but that's contributing for the reasons that I alluded to earlier. And we're seeing degradation of reefs and fisheries through a variety of things, clearing mangroves, but siltation of reefs, overexploitation of inshore fisheries, and so on. And the tragedy of this is that the economic benefits are not broadly based and inclusive. The money from these high value crops that we talk so much about go mainly to men, and if they're fortunate, they trickle through to women and families. And the benefits go predominantly to urban and peri-urban peoples rather than the rural and remote communities. And Sunshine Coast University ACPIR is involved in the sort of value chain studies that tell us a lot about how this happens, why it happens, and the sort of business development that feeds this system. And it's big questions of how these sort of high value crops can be, and the value chains that go with them can be managed better so that they are more inclusive and in various ways. Obviously, the other big thing about trying to depend on cash crops are fluctuating prices and exposure to economic shocks. Coffee all around the world goes up and down in price. Cocoa, which is the cross I have to bear, my farm has been just a low price for a long time, 2,000 American dollars a ton for more than 20 years. If you think how prices of labor, fertilizer, fuel have gone up over the last 20 years, you'll see that that's not a good deal either. So what we're saying is that, and okay, there are some other cash crops that vanilla, much higher, get 1,000 Fiji dollars a kilo instead of $2,000 a ton for vanilla. But most of the vanilla in the South Pacific Islands has not flowered in the last 2 years, presumably due to climate change factors, dry seasons not being cool and dry enough to force it to flower. And of course, the big cash crop of the moment, which seems to be driving the deforestation, has gone up, has changed over the last 10 years from being about, this kava has gone from $20 a kilo to in excess of $150 a kilo. Markets cooled slightly, has fallen back to about $80 or $90 a kilo at the moment. But that's still a huge incentive to cut down lots of rainforest if you are depending on a bush fallow system for production. And one of the things that I think has been documented, not in very extensive studies, mostly anecdotal, but this boom in kava, but the same can be applied to other profitable cash crops. If people put their agricultural effort into growing cash crops, this can have seriously negative impacts on nutrition and health, neglect of the diverse food crops that people need for a good diet. So why? So what we're searching for is greater resilience in the face, not just of economic pressures and economic shocks, but also, of course, the resilience in the face of climate change and extreme weather. This is what an agroforestry farm looks like about 3 weeks after the visit of a Category 5 cyclone. So this is this is my own farm after the visit of Cyclone Yasa. So this is January 2021. I was introduced earlier as a cocoa farmer, but I do have a bit of coffee as well. So these are the coffee bushes. As you see, they were in full berry at the time that they were not really exactly blown over. Those are not being killed outright, but they've been pretty severely punished. But the point of that is not to say, look at the poor old coffee. The point of this is to say that, okay, those were damaged at the time when they were just coming into fruit, but they're only a very small part of the cash flow of this particular farm. So the beauty of an agroforestry system, diversified agroforestry system, is not only does it stand up reasonably well to cyclones compared with some other agricultural systems, but just the sheer diversity means that you're hedging your bets. Okay, we lost the coffee that year, but in this system, this is basically a 1 hectare agroforestry system. There's something like 80 species of productive fruits, nuts, medicinal plants there, several of which could actually become significant money spinners under appropriate management, which I don't necessarily mean my own. I'm thinking more of it as a smallholder enterprise, right? So I'm not going to try and offer a prescription. As Wayne pointed out, it's not a case of one size fits all. You don't come up in a research lab with the perfect agroforestry system or in your CSIRO modeling platform to say the perfect agroforestry system is such and such. You need lots of options that people can fine tune for their own needs. But some of the things that we're probably looking for are landscapes with more trees, which assure these sort of ecosystem services that I was talking about earlier in relation to those degraded landscapes. Diversified livelihood options, so reducing dependence on a single crop or commodity that might fluctuate in price and or be knocked out by adverse weather, droughts, floods, et cetera, And what we probably need for greater resilience is a change in the policy settings and negotiating processes. Now, policy settings in Fiji are, probably should turn the recording off at this point, but there's a slight conflict of interest in the sense that the Minister of the Environment is also the Minister of Agriculture, and also also the Minister of Commerce, Trade, Tourism, Transport and Industry. Both of them think that a good photo opportunity is to go out into communities and give out free chainsaws. Now, I don't mean little pruning saws for pruning your cocoa. I mean 36 and 48-inch models, which are intended for clearing old growth rainforest. And the mentality is such that this is presumably official government policy, and it's also applauded in the press as boosting Fiji's exports. So, that's what I mean by maybe we need to rethink some of those policy settings and encouragement, some of the signals from decision makers. Negotiating processes, I guess I'm thinking more at the sort of any land use, change in land use in a situation like Fiji, where more than 80%, I think it's 85% of the land is under communal community ownership and therefore community management, is a complicated negotiating process, a mixture of kind of legally based modern style, I'm saying modern in a sense of 100-year-old, lease negotiations, but also just the decisions of the elders of the community and so on. And I think, you know, if you take a sort of anthropological view of these things, you can say, oh, well, Fijian communities allocate land use, land for decision-making in land use in such and such a way. But actually, these land use decisions are evolving quite rapidly in the face of economic opportunities, economic pressures, social changes. I mean, the thing that Wayne mentioned, that at least one community has actually allocated land to a women's group for cash cropping. This is almost unthinkable in traditional community-based decision-making, but it's happening, all right? It's also, we've heard through many ACIR projects that long-term investment in land, whether it's in fencing and irrigation or just soil fertility, is very difficult in a situation where land improvement often results, or an investment in land improvement often results in the land being allocated to somebody else more influential. It's a disincentive towards long-term decisions about land use. And this is also a big constraint on things like agroforestry, which depend on having a 20 or 30-year perspective, even if, as Wayne says, you're looking at cash crops that'll come through in 2, 3, 5 years. You're not just waiting for a mahogany tree or a teak tree in 20 or 30 years, but even if you're looking at intermediate products, 3 to 5 years is actually quite a long period in terms of community decisions about land resource allocations. So how is this system evolving, and what are the possibilities for encouraging that evolution towards thinking? Resilience thinking is long-term, you know, even if it's kind of no regrets decisions, it's still talking about long-term decisions on who gets what land for what. And so this obviously interacts with a sort of social study at community level, also interacts with government and policy studies. And then what's the role of agribusiness in catalyzing constructive change? Does this all have to be imposed by enlightened governments, or are there other ways of using the power of the private sector to try to do more long-term thinking that are moving towards greater resilience? I mean, businesses have an interest in economic resilience at the very least, and I suppose enlightened businesses think that that includes in investing in soil fertility and so on. The Bula Coffee enterprise that Wayne mentioned quite a bit in that presentation is also a partner in the PARDI agribusiness project that I think is coming up for review this week. So it's a good moment perhaps to think about how agribusiness research and development can actually catalyze constructive change. And then I think the big thing that there's been not nearly enough research about is, to what extent can carbon markets be harnessed to enable changes in land use, or to encourage chivvy changes in land use in particular directions? We're not necessarily thinking of the big formal carbon markets, but maybe more voluntary systems, corporate social responsibility, those kind of things, where businesses whose success is tied to the quality of the environment might wish to invest in these kind of things. And I'm not sure if that's a malfunction or whether that's, oh yes. So there's a little snapshot of an agroforestry system, which some of you will be familiar with. Basically, almost all the trees there that you can see have some sort of useful function, and in the middle of them, almost hidden to the unskilled eye are the cash crops. So hopefully in an environmentally friendly setting. So I suppose what, in concluding this seminar, I would like to invite you to reflect a bit on what kind of research for development might be helpful in nudging these kind of complex systems towards greater resilience, towards actually serving the needs of the communities and farmers who use them. My boss here, who comes from a country which grows a lot of coffee and so should know about these things, told me, well, coffee is not the answer. Well, that's good. That's good. I think the point is here is that I don't think it's up to us, even as people of concerned and interested individuals, to say coffee is the answer or cocoa and chocolate is the answer. What we're talking about is exploring how these systems can be moved towards better serving the interests of the communities that manage them and try to derive their livelihoods from them. And I would just like to suggest that, okay, Wayne talked about some coffee technology and how we can use some clever stuff in propagation techniques, in molecular biology and stuff to get the right coffee material out there. But you can see that a lot of the constraints are in the social arena. They're in the fields of economics and policy and all sorts of different dimensions. We mentioned also agribusiness, and hopefully I would like to suggest that an entity such as ACPIR or an association such as the Australian Centre for Pacific Island Research should be an ideal kind of forum to bring together these different strands and thinking to actually work together, not just to introduce coffee. That's probably not the answer, but you can see what I'm trying to fumble towards is the idea that interdisciplinary research can perhaps be helpful in trying to nudge these systems towards greater resilience, where they actually serve the needs of the smallholders and communities in these very fragile environments, and where I think people often don't really recognize that this is an urgent problem. The degradation of the natural resource base is palpable, it's visible. If you live there, you see it changing and getting worse year by year. You can even pick it up in the FAO statistics. People see declining productivity and they think, well, we can change the price of fertilizer, we can get more fertilizer out there. But actually, it's a much more fundamental problem about the underpinning, the way the system works, that is actually much more complicated to tackle than just changing the price of a bag of fertilizer or subsidizing the price of tractor fuel or whatever it is. So, I just sort of invite you to reflect on ways in which we might be able to work together to actually tackle some of these problems in a long-term way. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. I think you've certainly given us a lot to reflect on. So thanks, and thank you, Wayne, as well. Both of you, is a very insightful, interesting presentation. I've got to give you both credit because there was lots of pictures on those slides. And for me as a visual learner, that's what they're called, I'm called at least, that really helped to tell the story of what you're explaining to us today. Because for me, I look at that picture and I just see a landscape and some trees, but I don't understand the degradation or the actual plants or anything else going on. So it was really nice to have that to share your story. I'm assuming we've got a few questions that are going to be ready to fire at both of you. So if you're both happy to, we might go straight into them. I can see Danny already. You've got a list. Yeah, we'll start with Danny and then we'll move to someone else. If anyone online does have a question, pop your hand up. I think there's a little function. You put a little hand up there so that we know, or pop it in the chat and we will get round to everyone.
Wayne, mate, this one's going to be hostile. This is for you.
Here you go, Danny.
Incoming.
Yeah, I was going to say I was going to use our friendship to ask the annoying questions and in a friendly manner. But No, I just thought I would point back to, I think I would essentially agree with everything that was said in the presentation. And perhaps I would only like to annoyingly pick on one thing, and it's the title and the first slide, and the proposition that coffee as a foundation of for resilient livelihoods, I think. And I would like to take it like a few steps backwards, because I think that's where perhaps the research should be kind of framed from. And it's, what do we understand is a resilient livelihood? And why are we suggesting that coffee can be a foundation to that? And I think sort of like picking on that might shed light on a lot of different things, like Richard said, for example. And I was writing like a note of different elements that I thought perhaps are not necessarily compatible with what I at least understand as a resilient livelihood. But I'll just give you one example. As Richard said, I grew up in a country that was essentially made by the coffee industry. So it's a coffee producing country. For years, that was the backbone of the economy. And if I would to pick one of the scariest projections I could pick for what climate change is doing to agriculture, is what climate change is going to do to coffee. And so again, that's just an element. When we talk about resilience, if we're talking at it in a context of climate change, is also understanding what the crops and different species that we are promoting today gonna behave in 50 or 100 years. Again, coffee is a perennial plant. That means like an investment you're doing today is not gonna be fruitful until 3, 4, or 5 years down the track still. And any damage after a cyclone, whatever, brings you back essentially 5 years down the track. So I think approaching research, as I said, I don't necessarily disagree with what was said, especially towards the end of the presentation. But I think when we are engaging in these conversations, to me, it's useful to start, okay, how are we understanding resilience or resiliency in these systems? And how is it that the model of agri-food system that we are promoting fits within that definition and the potential risks for that? And again, I just use the example of sort of like my skepticism based on how grim the projections are, especially for arabica species. But I could go the same for example, the distribution of income, labor issues. You mentioned, for example, nutrient mining. Depends on how you base the system. Coffee can be one of the most nutrient mining industries you could have, especially if all the processing is done not on the farm. Okay. So yeah, just as a way to spark the conversation, I think a useful way to have these sort of like engagements is to start by defining, okay, what is it that we understand by resilience in these systems, and kind of take it from there.
Okay, I take on board all that. I think the reason for coffee initially was that we were working on agroforestry within the community, and we were planting quite a wide range of trees, which had both short and long-term impacts. We also started a little community nursery, and the main crop in the community nursery initially was vegetable seedlings, because that was a way they could see buy-in, because they're growing their own vegetables. They're also selling vegetables, and we also then had some long-term agroforestry species involved in that, and that nursery is still continuing, strangely enough, for a community nursery. The reason for focusing on coffee was that the women saw coffee as an economic incentive for them to do things. So, and then when you looked at the coffee system as such, the Bula Coffee model was quite a good model. It's utilising a resource which is already there. And from the point of view of resilience, you know, these coffee bushes have survived a long period of time. Bula found a unique market. It's a small international market as well as a small local market, and they don't pretend to compete with South America or Colombia or wherever. So coffee wasn't done as the only activity, but coffee was an economic driver that the people could relate to, because women got the money directly into their bank account. So, and it was a way also of then getting the community to think about production systems which women could do in the longer term. So I wouldn't envisage only doing coffee or cocoa or whatever as the only crops. But it was a starting point, and it provides an incentive for people. There's quite a lot of other nuts, native nuts and so forth we were looking at there, which are important to the community, and they're quite resilient plants as well. They're important as a food source. Some of them have export potential if they're developed further. So, I mean, coffee is isn't the only answer. It was just a way of getting into the system where people had an interest in that because the interest had been developed. There was a commercial link. Resilience is kind of one of those complicated words. I've just come back from Malawi in Africa, where I looked at sort of 20-year-old projects to do with soil fertility and erosion control. Very frustrating. They've got some excellent trees there that work quite well, like Fade-herbia, which is a leguminous tree with unusual characteristics. It drops its leaves in the wet season, and you can grow crops all underneath it, and it's quite good at maintaining soil fertility. But when I come to the final presentation, I suggested they just mass plant Fade-herbia, because if they want to grow maize, and maize yield doubles under Fade-herbia trees, you know, you run into the problems that Richard is talking about, where there's the policy problems and people talk about fertiliser and so forth. They can't afford the fertiliser. So there's no simple solution. And you know, resilience is a difficult word. There's almost, if you take people out of the system, then resilience returns, basically. So yeah, I take on board your point. Coffee isn't the answer to everything, and coffee monocropping certainly isn't. I've seen that as well. So I think, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think probably we choose coffee as a slightly provocative one because it forces you to address some of these issues, the complexities of it. And, you know, I think, you know, one of them is you look at the possibly that those remnant Ethiopian genotypes might actually produce the best quality coffee and actually might be the most valuable, but actually in a changing climate, some of those hybrids with Conifer and Liberica are probably going to be much more resilient in the long term. So that's why, you know, the coffee side of the research might be looking towards which ones of those can actually satisfy the needs of the market in terms of quality and price and so on, and but be a better part of the more resilient system. And obviously, there's something about, you know, choosing a crop that's quite demanding as your flagship of your system, if you like, in that it forces you to address these things, whereas the sort of hardy manage as you go along kind of crops, which don't give you as much return but kind of survive anyhow, they don't force you to really look at these issues like soil fertility, pest disease management, markets, processing, quality, and so on, which have to be tackled if these systems are actually going to, you know, improve livelihoods rather than just enable people to survive. Probably survive in a declining economic spiral, because, you know, you can look at the example of coconut. You know, that was 100 years ago. Coconut was the gold of the Pacific. That's what made people rich in the Pacific. That's why people 100 years ago chopped down all the coastal rainforest in places like Fiji and got rich growing coconut oil. But, you know, now it's become a poverty trap because coconuts are incredibly hardy trees. They still go on producing anything, even as the soil is completely degraded, as you get saline intrusions. It's still not worth cutting them down and replacing them with something more productive, more valuable, you know. So that's why, you know, it's good to look at these trade-offs between investment and returns and how that interacts with people's expectations and aspirations. You know, again, putting people's livelihood aspirations right back in the center of the picture. And then the choice of crops is just a means to an end, trying to see how they might be harnessed to meet people's aspirations, I think.
We have Jared, who's been patiently waiting to ask a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Wayne and Richard. Thanks very much for that. It's super interesting stuff. I was just curious if you guys had a feel for the percentage of areas that could be transformed using these agroforestry approaches. You know, there seemed to be, with that picture you showed, quite a large area of degraded landscape. Do you think, it would be feasible to scale this to 5% of the landscape, or 50, or, across multiple islands? How would you see this scaling, given all the challenges and the political constraints and other things? It's a very tough question, I know, but I was just curious if you had a feel for that at all.
Well, we did sort of look at this when we were planning the agroforestry project that Wayne alluded to. We looked at it specifically around the Nandi Basin area, which is that sort of area with the picture of the plume of mud going out into the bay. And probably the figure is somewhere between 20 and 30% of the landscape. I suppose we're not talking about the alluvial flatlands. We're not talking about the highest watersheds that should probably be left as natural forests. So we're looking at the sloping lands in between. It'll be different for different landforms, but in these kind of old volcanic high islands, we're probably talking about 20, 30, 40% of the land, that sort of order of magnitude, I'd guess. What do you think, Wayne? You also consider Vanuatu as well. I mean, some places you'd probably like to leave more of the land under natural forest for biodiversity, amenity, and carbon farming, possibly, but carbon markets. But in an area like Fiji and the more occupied bits of Vanuatu and Solomon Islands.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of room for scaling it up, but the problem is you've got to demonstrate success on the ground, and that's kind of the contradiction of the problem, really. The land area to work with and to amend is certainly large. Communities, control certainly in Fiji, they control very large amounts of land, but utilise very small amounts of it, in direct production. So the good bits they already farm for their vegetables or whatever. And then you've got transition areas, and then you've got large areas, as Richard was pointing out, the areas in the upper slopes, which they just burn every year for no particular reason. So I think there's a scaling up the slope, and we talked about this with the community where they would want to do this sort of work, and that's part of the reason they said, oh well, we'll look at it and we'll allocate the women some land up there, which is kind of outside the what is considered to be the production area now for vegetables and so forth. It's on a slope. It's currently not used for anything. It's not important to anybody, either of the clans who own that territory, so to speak, because it's not being utilised for anything now. And so it's kind of an issue of starting somewhere and expanding from there and demonstrating the value. But in terms of scale, the scale is really huge in terms of actually developing that land. There's a lot of it.
Okay, thanks. Cheers.
Oh, we shouldn't forget the cost of it as well. I mean, the problem is with these heavily degraded lands, the fertile topsoil has been lost or hammered. Sugarcane and that Imperata cylindrica is very hard on soil organic matter, soil nutrients. It's a huge effort to rehabilitate that land. I guess one of the things we tried to look at in the Nandi Basin area was the possibility of using kind of payment for ecosystem services as a way to fuel and cover this, or get started on this rehabilitation cost. Once you start to rehabilitate the land and it starts to become productive, it's a bit more self-sustaining, but you certainly need, there's a potentiation. You've got to get the thing started to start to restore these heavily degraded soils. And the idea of the payment for ecosystem services is that, all right, the communities are living on these upriver sloping lands, but the people with the money, the transport infrastructure, the airport, the hotels and stuff, they're in the downstream areas of these catchments and are subject to flooding because of the siltation and so on. So they have an interest in seeing those upper reaches of this rivers restored and reforested. So, and you can imagine sort of that's the tourist industry is also the big money spinner in those lowland coastal areas. They have an interest, whether they realize it or not, in having a decent looking environment, being able to take their guests out to see functioning traditional farming systems. You know, that was the idea of payment for ecosystem services, but it's actually quite hard to set up that sort of system. Hence the sort of need to look at things like, can we harness carbon markets to drive these changes, things like that. We definitely need innovative ways to catalyze and encourage and enable change. It's not going to happen by itself.
Thank you, Richard. I was just checking if we had any questions in the chat, but it looks like there was just a few thank yous there to both of you. I think we'll finish up there because it is heading to 1:10 now. But thank you both of you for giving us such in-depth answers to those questions. You certainly thought about them and shared your reasoning there. And thank you both for your time today. Thank you for meeting with us, Richard, Wayne online. Thank you for the incredible presentation, very interesting. You've given us a lot to think about and reflect on. So everybody else online, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks, Wayne. Let's get we're on a roll here. We've got people interested. Let's see if we can launch a project.
No, thank you, mate. That's good.
Bridge to Reef.
Wayne.
Bridge to Reef. Yeah, yeah. Finished. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think